Our scripture lesson for tonight comes from Matthew's Gospel, the 13th chapter, the 31st through the 35th verses, page 1490 in your pew Bibles. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch in its branches. And Jesus told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He didn't say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. May God add his blessing to this reading of his word, the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. These two very short parables in Matthew's gospel immediately follow two longer parables. Jesus teaches them perhaps because the disciples were saddened to hear the parable of the sower, where 3/4 of the seeds perish, and discouraged by the parable of the weeds, which allowed wicked men to flourish and prosper. I'd like to assign you homework of reading these two parables from the 13th chapter of Matthew later tonight, okay? Parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds. Perhaps Jesus may have spoken these two parables about the mustard seed and yeast in order to cheer and encourage the disciples. In the Middle East, a mustard seed is used as a kind of measurement, describing something that is very, very tiny. Jesus knew that something of great significance can come from something that is very small. A mustard seed, although it may not be the smallest of all seeds, is nevertheless among the smallest. I preached on the mustard seed parable while I was chaplain at the children's home, but I mixed things up a bit. I had a watermelon seed, and in a cooler I had the biggest watermelon that I could find. I had a tiny little scale that you use to weigh letters, and I weighed the seed, and it barely registered at all on the male scale. I borrowed a scale, a big scale, from the commissary, and I weighed the watermelon that I'd brought, and it weighed in at over 22 pounds. It was a big melon. The children and the youth oohed and awed at how such a small seed could generate such a big melon in just a matter of weeks. And then I explained that the vine that produced this melon from a single seed more than likely produced as well 5 or 6 other watermelons just like this one. So a seed that weighed virtually nothing could conceivably produce as much as 154 pounds of mouth-watering watermelon. After the service, I took the melon outside, sliced it up, and everyone enjoyed a slice of ice-cold melon. I told this story before. I had the residents and their house parents spit the seeds into the rose garden in front of the chapel. And each summer, for 5 or 6 years after that, we continued to enjoy slices of watermelon after chapel services. The tiny little mustard seed, likewise, can grow into a plant so big that when it grows, it becomes the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that birds of the air can come and perch in its branches. And that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. It comes from God, and it starts from the smallest of beginnings, but no one knows what shape it will take or what it will ultimately look like. In the Middle East and in the Old Testament, one of the commonest pictures of a great empire is the picture of a giant tree. There's just something about a large, majestic tree. In Florida, the greatest example of an impressive, majestic tree, I think, would probably be a live oak, with its enormous canopy that can reach several hundred feet in width, and its root system can keep them anchored even in the face of the most powerful of hurricanes. And a live oak tree does, in fact, grow from a tiny little acorn. And then Jesus reinforced his point with yet another parable. This has got to be a biblical record of some kind. 2 parables spoken by Jesus in the space of 3 verses. Jesus could be a man of few words sometimes, but the words packed much power. Jesus continued, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. Yeast, or leaven, as the older translations refer to it, would have been somewhat of a shocking reference for Jesus to make, because in Jewish language and thought, leaven almost always carries an evil connotation. Leaven actually stood for that which was evil in the world. Jesus probably used this common household illustration to get his listeners' attention and curiosity. What? Did he just refer to the kingdom of heaven as yeast? To hear the kingdom of heaven compared to yeast would have aroused interest and curiosity, as the unusual and unexpected usually does. Jesus used a variety of methods to capture his listeners' attention. Last week, remember, he crouched down and he wrote in the dust. The whole point of this short little parable lies in one thing: the transforming power of the yeast. The yeast transforms the dough, doesn't it? The introduction of yeast causes a transformation in the dough. The coming of the kingdom as well causes a transformation in a life. For a number of years, Libby made sourdough bread. It was awesome. Made great French toast. She'd gotten the starter from my sister Debbie, who had been making the bread for years before that. The starter is a concoction that you keep in the refrigerator, and you feed sugar and potato flakes and water every week. And from that you add flour, toss it in the oven, and presto, you have sourdough bread. Libby would usually bake a loaf a week. This was when we were at the children's home, and when someone from the maintenance department at the children's home had to come and make a repair at the parsonage, Libby would thank them by giving them a just-baked, still warm loaf of sourdough bread. Wasn't long before the guys in maintenance were fighting over who got to make a repair at the chaplain's parsonage. My dad was a school teacher, and he taught me, if you treat the custodians well, they'll take care of you. As well, from time to time at the children's home, Libby would give a warm loaf of bread to house parents and the residents of their cottage for going the second mile in some way. Libby's bread developed quite the reputation. One particular house parent who loved to cook, John, would bake a big chocolate chip cookie for our Super Bowl parties at the chapel. And John asked Libby for some starter of his own, and Libby was happy to oblige. She took a glass jar. I punched a couple of nail holes in the lid, and she poured a portion of her starter into the jar. I took it to West Gilbert Cottage with the simple instructions, and John and the boys of West Gilbert were thrilled. We're going to have us our own sourdough bread every week. It just so happened that Libby was rearranging things in our refrigerator that evening, and her jar of sourdough starter slipped off the shelf and shattered on the tile kitchen floor. The starter was lost. As we both stood mourning, at about the same time, it dawned on us both that John has some starter. So the next morning, after the boys in the cottage had gone to school, I went to West Gilbert and told John what had happened. Without saying a word, he walked to the kitchen and came back holding his jar of sourdough starter as though it was the most precious thing in the world. Because at that moment he knew there was no more. I took John's starter back to the parsonage, poured a portion of it into a brand new jar, and Libby was in the sourdough bread baking business again. And I returned to John his jar and its portion of the starter. It was another wonderful illustration. If Libby had not shared some of her starter with John, and Libby's jar had broken on the kitchen floor, it would have been lost forever. But because she had shared it, there was more to go around. There are great blessings, even great power in small things. Many of you come to this church because of its size, right? Most of you drive by larger churches to come to this church. A good number of you have worshiped in larger churches that are significantly larger than this one, and yet here you are. Our church actually is not a small church. A small church, by definition, is a church that has an average worship attendance of 50 or less. A very high percentage of United Methodist congregations qualify as small churches. Our church then, based on those numbers, actually is a medium-sized church. But don't underestimate us, regardless of how big or small we are. This church does mighty and significant things. We're certainly not perfect, though. Not that there exists that perfect church. Some individuals or families spend their entire lifetime searching for that perfect church, going from church to church, only to be continually disappointed. We can always improve, certainly, on the way that we care for one another within our congregation, but most importantly, care for those beyond these four walls. There's always improvement that can take place in the way that we share the love of Jesus and make his love known. May God use each of us to make his transformational ways known far and wide. It's wonderful that all of you are here tonight. I pray that this has been a worshipful experience for you thus far, and that has been much more than merely a good habit of coming to church. It's always my prayer that this will have been a special and significant time for you to connect with other worshipers, and most importantly, for you to make a connection or a reconnection with the God that loves you so very dearly. This church, your church, is here to support you, but most importantly, here to offer you opportunities to live out your life of faith, utilizing your unique gifts and graces and abilities, making a real difference in a large and dark and frightened and frightening world. As we are called to be a part of this kingdom of heaven, we are all called to grow a faith that oftentimes starts out very small and weak, and then in time develops into something that is large and deep and strong, that really does make a difference in the world. We're also called to be yeast that has a transformational impact on our world, and especially within the lives with whom we have influence over. We are called to live our lives so that others may observe the peace and purpose that we have discovered since we have given our hearts to Jesus, so that others will be inclined to think to themselves, gee, I want what they have. How winsome is your faith in Jesus to others? How are you doing on that? How are you doing?